there's something absolutely fascinating happening. You know that friend who's clearly overwhelmed with work, exhausted, barely sleeping, and you tell them, "Hey, let me help you with some of this," and they immediately shut it down. No, I got it. I can handle it. Even though their hands are literally shaking and they're about to snap. Or that colleague who just went through a breakup, who's obviously hurting, and when you reach out to check in, they deflect. They change the subject. They put on that mask, and suddenly they're fine. Everything's fine. Nothing to worry about. There are millions of people who would rather collapse under the weight of their own struggles than simply admit to another human being, "I can't do this alone right now." And according to modern psychology, these people have very specific neurological and emotional patterns that explain why asking for help feels so visceral, so absolutely wrong to them. Stay with me, because I'm about to uncover how rejecting help isn't just about being too independent. It's not just stubbornness. It's definitely not just lacking trust in others. It goes much deeper than that. It has to do with how your brain was constructed, how you see yourself in the world, and some of the most primitive psychological mechanisms that govern how you interact with other people. Let's start with the obvious question. Why do so many people hate asking for help? The answer is not what you think. Most people assume it's because asking for help makes you look weak, but that's actually too simplistic. The real reason is buried deeper, in something psychologists call perceived autonomy. Your brain is literally wired to associate asking for help with loss of control. When you ask for help, your brain registers it as a surrender of agency. You're giving someone else power over your situation. And for people who hate asking for help, that feeling is genuinely threatening. Here's what's happening at the neurological level. When someone who struggles to ask for help considers the idea of reaching out, their amygdala, the fear center of the brain, starts firing. Not because they're afraid of the person they'd ask, but because they're afraid of the vulnerability itself. Their brain is literally treating the act of asking as a threat, and this isn't random. This comes from somewhere. Usually it comes from childhood. A lot of people who refuse help grew up in environments where they couldn't rely on adults. Maybe their parents were emotionally unavailable. Maybe they were inconsistent. Maybe there was actual chaos at home, and the only person they could depend on was themselves. Their young brains learned a fundamental lesson. Other people will let you down, so the safest option is to never need them in the first place. But here's where it gets interesting. That early learning doesn't disappear. It gets encoded into your nervous system. It becomes what attachment researchers call anxious avoidant attachment. These people developed a survival strategy as children that made perfect sense then. They couldn't afford to depend on anyone, so they built walls. They learned to solve problems alone. They learned to never show weakness. And as adults, even when their environment changes, even when they're surrounded by people who would help them without question, that old programming is still running in the background. It's like your brain is still protecting you from dangers that no longer exist. And here's the thing nobody really talks about. The act of asking for help requires something that most people take for granted, but people with this pattern find incredibly difficult. It requires vulnerability. Not just any vulnerability. It requires admitting that you don't have all the answers, that you're struggling, that you're not completely self-sufficient. And if your entire identity has been built on the foundation of, "I can handle anything alone," then admitting otherwise feels like your entire sense of self is crumbling. Research from the University of Pennsylvania found that people with strong independence need show increased activity in the brain regions associated with shame and self-criticism when they even contemplate asking for help. Their brains literally punish them for the idea. But wait, it gets more complicated because the resistance to asking for help isn't always about independence. Sometimes it's about something researchers call reciprocity anxiety. These people have a deep, sometimes unconscious fear of being indebted to someone. When you ask for help, you're creating a social obligation. You owe them something. Maybe not money, maybe not a direct favor, but something shifts in the relationship. And for people with a history of broken relationships or betrayal, that shift feels dangerous. Studies show that people who've experienced significant betrayal or abandonment are significantly more likely to avoid asking for help, even when they desperately need it. Their brains have learned that accepting help creates leverage that others can use against you. There's also something called locus of control that plays a huge role here. People who hate asking for help typically have what psychologists call an internal locus of control. They believe that outcomes in their life are primarily determined by their own action. Which sounds great, right? Self-determination, agency, personal responsibility. But here's the dark side. When something goes wrong and they can't fix it themselves, their brain interprets that not as I need help, but as I have failed. And that's a devastating feeling, because if you believe you control everything and something goes wrong, then the problem isn't the situation, it's you. You're not capable enough. You're not strong enough. You're not competent enough. So instead of asking for help, they just try harder. They push themselves further. They sacrifice their own well-being because admitting defeat feels like admitting fundamental inadequacy. And here's something that really explains the psychology. People who refuse help often have what's called high personal standards. And I'm not talking about healthy ambition. I'm talking about standards that are genuinely unattainable. They hold themselves to impossible expectations because, unconsciously, they believe that if they're perfect enough, if they never need anything from anyone, then they're safe. If they're completely self-reliant, completely independent, completely in control, then they can never be hurt by depending on someone who lets them down. It's actually a trauma response, even if the person doesn't realize they're traumatized. This connects to something called the savior complex, which is interesting because a lot of these people who hate asking for help are actually the types to drop everything to help others. They're the ones who say yes to every request. They're the ones who have trouble setting boundaries because saying no feels selfish. And this isn't generosity. This is actually a coping mechanism. By helping others without ever asking for help themselves, they maintain their narrative of complete independence. They prove to themselves and the world that they don't need anyone. But here's the problem. That's not sustainable. No human being can exist in a state of complete self-sufficiency. And the longer someone goes without asking for help, without letting people support them, the more isolated they become. Not necessarily physically isolated, but emotionally. They're surrounded by people, but nobody knows what's really going on. Nobody knows they're struggling. And that emotional isolation is actually correlated with depression, anxiety, and significantly higher rates of burnout. There's research from Stanford that shows people who consistently refuse help have cortisol levels that remain elevated for longer periods. Their stress doesn't resolve, it just accumulates. Because they never get the actual support they need, their nervous system never fully calms down. They're in a state of perpetual mild crisis. And after years of this, their brain actually becomes wired to expect constant struggle. They develop what's called struggle identity. Their sense of self becomes intertwined with being the person who handles everything alone. And if they actually ask for help, and someone helps them, it creates this weird cognitive dissonance. If someone helped me, and I still survived, then maybe I'm not who I thought I was. That's actually terrifying for some people. But here's where the research gets really interesting. Studies show that people who refuse help actually experience significant dopamine hits from solving problems on their own. When they overcome something without asking for help, their brain releases dopamine. They feel accomplished. They feel capable. They feel like they've proven something to themselves and the world. And that becomes addictive. They start seeking out problems to solve alone, just to get that dopamine hit. They create unnecessary struggle in their lives because the struggle itself has become rewarding. And asking for help means losing that reward. It means not getting to experience that sense of triumph. It's almost like they've become addicted to the pain of self-sufficiency. Now, there's another layer that most people completely miss. Power dynamics. A lot of people who hate asking for help have deep-seated issues around control and power. They grew up in situations where they had no power. Maybe their parents made all their decisions. Maybe they were in an abusive situation. Maybe they were constantly told what to do and how to do it. So as adults, they become obsessed with never being in that position again. They need to be the one with power. They need to be the one in control. And asking for help flips that dynamic. It puts them in a subordinate position, at least temporarily. It means someone else has something they need. It means they're dependent. And that triggers all the old fear and trauma around powerlessness. What's wild is that this pattern often shows up in very specific ways. These people tend to be perfectionist. They tend to overwork themselves. They tend to have what's called poor work-life boundaries. They're the ones who answer emails at midnight. They're the ones who take on projects they don't have time for. They're the ones who cancel plans because work is more important. And it's not because they're naturally ambitious. It's because work is a domain where they have complete control, where they can be self-sufficient, where they don't have to depend on anyone, Work is safe in a way that asking for help never is. And here's something really important that psychology research has revealed. People who resist asking for help often have distorted beliefs about what asking for help actually means. They believe it means burdening someone. They believe it means being a problem. They believe it means admitting permanent failure. But that's not what it means. Asking for help is actually a sign of emotional intelligence. It's a sign that you understand human limitation. It's a sign that you value relationships enough to be vulnerable with people. But people with this pattern can't see that. Their brain is filtering all incoming information through a lens of shame and inadequacy. So when someone offers help, they don't hear, "I care about you and I want to support you." They hear, "You're failing and you need rescuing." There's also something called cognitive distortion that plays a massive role. People who hate asking for help tend to catastrophize. They imagine worst-case scenarios. If I ask for help, they'll think I'm incompetent. They'll lose respect for me. They'll tell everyone I'm weak. They'll use this against me later. Their brains are running these disaster scenarios on loop, and those scenarios feel very real. But here's the thing. Research consistently shows that when people actually ask for help, the response is almost always positive. People generally want to help. People generally don't judge. People generally feel closer to someone after helping them, not further away. But none of that matters if your brain isn't able to process that information accurately. Your fear is too loud. Now, let's talk about something really important. The gender dynamics of this. Men are significantly more likely to refuse help than women. And this is not biological. This is cultural. Boys are socialized from an early age to be independent, to be strong, to not cry, to not show weakness. Boys don't ask for help. So by the time they're adults, refusing help has become deeply intertwined with their sense of masculinity. Asking for help feels emasculating. And this is devastating because men actually need help more in some ways. Men have higher rates of suicide, depression, and substance abuse, and one of the major factors is isolation. They're less likely to reach out. They're less likely to have close friendships where they can be vulnerable. And the cultural pressure to never ask for help is literally killing people. But it's not just men. A lot of high-achieving women refuse help too, because they've learned that in order to be taken seriously in male-dominated spaces, they have to be twice as competent. They have to do twice as much. They can't show weakness. If they ask for help, they'll be seen as less capable. So they push themselves harder and harder until they burn out. And even when they're burning out, they refuse to ask for help because admitting they need help feels like confirming all the biases against them. Here's what's really interesting though. Psychologists have found that people who struggle to ask for help often have a completely different problem when the tables are turned. When someone asks them for help, they often feel obligated to say yes, even if they don't have capacity. They feel resentful and guilty at the same time. They help, but they're angry about it. And that's because they've never internalized the idea that asking for help is okay. So when someone else does it, it triggers all their own buried feelings. It's like they're reacting to their own need for help through someone else. And here's something that most people don't realize. Refusing help actually creates more problems in the long run. When you don't ask for help, small problems become big problems. Big problems become crises. And crises often force you to ask for help anyway, but in a much more desperate, much more shameful way. Suddenly, you're not asking for help on your own terms. You're asking for help because you're drowning. And that makes the whole experience worse. Your brain associates asking for help with crisis instead of with healthy interdependence. It reinforces all the negative beliefs you already have. But here's the part that's actually hopeful. This pattern can change. Not overnight, but it can. Research shows that people who learn to ask for help, who practice vulnerability, who gradually build trust with others, their brains actually start to rewire. The amygdala response decreases. The shame response decreases. They start to experience relationships differently. They start to feel less alone. And ironically, they become more capable, not less. Because when you have support, when you have people who care about you, when you can distribute the burden instead of carrying everything yourself, you actually function better. You're less stressed, you're more creative, you're more resilient, you're more human. The thing is, asking for help is not weakness. Weakness is staying silent while you suffer. Weakness is isolating yourself because you're afraid of what people will think. Weakness is maintaining a false image of strength while falling apart on the inside. Real strength is knowing when you need support and having the courage to ask for it. Real strength is being vulnerable enough to let people see your struggles. Real strength is understanding that interdependence is not the same as dependence. We're social creatures. We're built to help each other. And the people who refuse help are actually going against human nature. They're fighting against what we're designed to do. And here's what researchers have discovered. The people who are happiest, who are most satisfied with their lives, who have the strongest relationships, they're not the ones who never need help. They're the ones who can ask for it. They're the ones who can be vulnerable. They're the ones who understand that accepting help doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. It makes you real. It makes you relatable. And it actually deepens your relationships instead of keeping you separate. So what does all this mean? If you hate asking for help, you're not broken. You're not selfish. You're not weak. You're just scared. And that's okay. Your brain learned a long time ago that needing things was dangerous, that depending on people was risky, that the only way to survive was to do it all yourself. But you're not in survival mode anymore, and you don't have to be. The next time you catch yourself refusing help, pause for a second. Notice what your brain is doing. Notice the shame. Notice the fear. Notice the stories you're telling yourself. Because once you can see the pattern, you can start to change it. You can start to ask for small things. You can start to let people in a little bit at a time. You can start to experience what it's like to be supported. And you might discover that it feels pretty good. You might discover that people actually want to help. You might discover that you're not as alone as you thought you were. And that, believe it or not, might be the most powerful thing you ever let yourself feel.